Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for being willing to engage in this conversation with me today. As you know, I have been taking a class known as Race, Gender, and Colonialism, and it's a really interesting class that looks through the lenses of the practices taken in colonization and ideas formed around race and gender during this time, and how it has changed throughout different social contexts and period of time, and also how it pertains to the context as we are in now. And so, personally, I've always stood for understanding the history and the past in order to make sense of the future. And I think that recently there has been a lot of pushback, or not a lot of pushback, but in the past at least, the conversation around colonization and the violence that has resulted from it and ultimately been presented through current issues that we face throughout the world of racism and ideas around gender and race in general, they're very apparent today, and we have to look at them through the lens of a historical context. So I personally believe historical context must be understood in order to make sense of the current world in which we live today. And so the effects of colonial and imperialism are still with us today very heavily. And so one of the big things that brought this up for me was during spring break, I went to the Natural History Museum. And when you're walking through the Natural History Museums, there's a lot of different exhibits, or a lot of different, I want to call them dioramas to see, or they call them scenes. Sometimes there's animal, but there's also people that they pay attention to because it's natural history. And so I had stumbled onto a scene where it was looking at two Native Americans and the Dutch from Old New York. And it was very interesting because it stood out to me. And there on the scene, there was a giant poster that said, "Reconsidering the scene. The 1660 encounter between Dutch and Lenape leaders was intended to celebrate the Dutch founders of Old New York. But this scene offers only stereotypical representation and ignores how complex and violent colonization was for Native people." And it's interesting because I think this is not one of the first times, but where historians and people who are in charge of, well, not in charge of, who had the archives are trying to look at the acts of colonization for what they really are through the violence and how they have shaped the world in which we live in today. And so I think this also stems into modern, where we are in America especially. There's been a lot of resurgence of the conversation around race, specifically in 2020. I think starting with just the murder of George Floyd really created a conversation again in America, questioning what it means to be white and what it means to be black. And there's also this understanding of how the system really works. And I think it's one of these times when a lot of people are getting to look at race in a different way and questioning the historical context behind it. And so I want to lead into just some of the historical context surrounding colonialism and how it has gone through over time and how it has changed, and some of the ways that we see it in modern day society, specifically in America as well. And I definitely want to take some parallels to ideas that we worked with in class or any events that we worked with in class and see how they correlate with what we see now. But just before I get into that, do you have any questions for me or relaying anything at all?
No questions, but I love what you're doing. I wish I could have taken this class because it's so interesting to me. I've always thought the same as you, that you have to understand historical context in order to understand really what's going on today and in the future. And colonization, it just had a huge impact on our entire world.
Yeah.
So,
and I really hope that this does open up just to see how the depth of it, because I mean, as a Black woman, like, I know through living, but learning through and really understanding and getting to see key evidence and pieces from, we talked about this thing called an archive, and an archive is kind of like a massive information, and a lot of times is what historians do is can make context out of that. but it comes into the question, who's in charge of the archive? Who's in charge of making history? And so you really have to dig through and put things together and think through the lenses of race and gender to kind of put it together. And that's really hard to ask of people to see the world today through that lens. But definitely it is very eye-opening and something that I think is very important. So one of the first things that I do want to reiterate about whiteness is that it's very ambiguous. It's going to be a very ambiguous term because it constantly is going to change over time, from when it's first used to make differences between races, what whiteness means versus what whiteness means now in America. And so to me, whiteness truly came into play when there was kind of this dissolving of those who emigrated from Europe into America, into the new land, and needing to find a way to fill the gap of the identity, of the diffusion of national European attachment. And so it's like the rebellion against Europe, which makes whiteness very ambiguous, and it changes on context, like I said, but the one thing whiteness can't be is blackness and darkness, or anything that is like the antithesis of that which is blackness. So that is the one thing that I will say stays pretty constant. But who is white or isn't, that kind of opens up more as we go through time. So that's why it's very ambiguous and has the ability to expand and contract depending on the social context it's in and who benefits from it. So I wanted to preface that before. All right. So in context, my first thing is colonialism. When you think of that, what do you hear? Like, what would you define it as?
I mean, through my own personal lens, when I hear the word, I think about my parents, because my mom, her ancestry is English. She's of English ancestry, and my dad is of Afro-Caribbean ancestry. So, I mean, I just think of countries being ransacked and massacred.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good overview and a gist of it, and I really appreciate you bringing in, first of all, a really big colonial power, which was the crown. The British Empire was really huge and had a big role to play as a colonial power, and really kind of offset and change the course of it. And also, you mentioned like the Caribbean, which is also really important to bring up, because one of the reasons what colonialism really was the policy of practicing, or you acquire partial political control over another country, and you occupy it with settlers, and you exploit it economically. And typically you remove the natives through acts of violence. And this doesn't just have to be like fighting. Violence comes in many different forms, which we'll explore. But bringing that up, colonialism was really an economic thing initially. And so in bringing that up with the Caribbean, it was economically abused because, they could use it to grow sugar, which was a really big one, at a lot. And doing this initially gave European countries quite a lot of money. And so in order to justify this idea of colonialism and put themselves at a better position and kind of rationalize it, they had to adopt a couple of ideologies in order to rationalize it. And so one of the most progressive ways that they did this was this idea of a civilizing mission. And so they came to this conclusion because Europe had kind of come through this idea of enlightenment. And in this, they were really obsessed, specifically and they were very obsessed with finding their place in the world and everything in the context around them. So they're really into classification, identification,
industrialization.
Exactly, yes. That also has a really big part to play in it. So through this process of enlightenment, right, they're making sense of the world with respect to themselves. And so if they're trying to exploit someone, especially from a different country, and one of the big things that they notice is going to be the difference in their skin tone, and they already have this ideology that they're supposed to civilize other people because they're viewing the way the world works in them, right? They're going to other people. They have this power to basically travel across globes, right? So they already view it as we're going to them, like it's our job to show them the way. And so they made use of racism really well. And so stemming from European Enlightenment thinkers who were again obsessed with the order of the order of the world, they would use their encounters as a ranking system to develop human classification. And in this, Europeans and Caucasians, they typically stayed on top, and the bottom was usually people from Africa or black people, and in between that it was like varying of who they came in contact with. And so like again, like there was this undeniable fact that to them that they were better, even though it was perverted with racism. They just couldn't see past the ignorance of that during that time. And so making use of social Darwinism as well, and which was the belief that different races were inherently going to be unequal, that a struggle between them was natural, and eventually stronger races would remove the perceived inferior. And this is kind of stemming off of the idea of like natural selection, right? Like Darwin's ideas of natural selection, and that some species are just going to be better than others. People would take those ideas and apply them to races and humans as well. And this idea of like heavily racialized scientific or scientific racism.
Scientific racism
is this idea.
It's funny to me though, because black genes are the dominant genes. So it doesn't really add up.
Well, I mean, none of it makes sense, you know? That's why there's also this idea of like why whiteness can never be stable is just because it doesn't make sense. And so they constantly have to shift what it means to be white or what it means to be superior. Because they're constantly time and time proven again that it is not. And it's only for their gain, and they have that power, so they have the ability to do that because they have this idea of majority status. And so you also brought in this idea of industrialization, which was something I wanted to touch on because this really took off and caused the world order to change and really gave Europe an advantage. Going through the Enlightenment, they also entered into the Industrial Revolution, and so especially with Britain, a lot of inventions of like put them ahead, especially with boats, and they were being able to project power across the oceans and into many continents. That just kind of again convinced and fed into the idea that Europe was all powerful and that success was for white people and that the people from the West were inherently superior. And so you put two and two together, you apply these ideas about industrialization and capitalization and who is in charge of leading the world forward, also tied with social Darwinism and scientific racism to justify it, really enforces that whites should dominate the weak and that they had a right to, and that it was their mission. And so already you can see how race has now become inextricable from colonizing. So from here, the idea is that those who are darker or are black, they need to be civilized. They need to be shown the right way. We're able to exploit them and not feel bad about it either.
Because they're not really human.
Exactly.
They're not really as good as us.
And no one can question that either. So it just keeps feeding into it. And it's very interesting to see like how from this thinking the atrocities and violence that was expected and inflicted on those who were not white really puts it into focus how deep this idea was and how it was a fact. It wasn't just an idea, it was a fact, you know.
They genuinely believed it.
Genuinely did. So there's a couple of ideas that were formed during colonization especially interacting with race and gender that we looked at during class that were ideas that I really wanted to present and draw parallels between some of the things that we came in contact with class and how I think they're currently still maybe a little shifted than what they were, but still very similar, like substantially similar to some of the ways that people were thinking about race and gender in these earlier colonial contexts as well, and how they pertain in America. It's just super interesting. So one of the first things we read was between the colonial power Britain and how they interacted with New Zealand. And it was very interesting because when they came into it, they actually viewed the natives of New Zealand as inferior, but not inferior enough that they weren't capable of becoming white. And so this kind of also gets back to the other idea of displacing natives and through violent acts, but not necessarily through killing somebody. So they brought in this idea of racial amalgamation. And just from hearing that word, what can you think of that being?
Amalgamation? Some sort of change.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
So to amalgamate means to combine, essentially. So racial amalgamation was basically the Crown's way of removing the natives of New Zealand through breeding them out in interracial relationships. So it was the white colonizers, the men were able to engage in interracial marriages between the women there, and in the hopes to breed out the native people by displacing them continuously, and removing acts of culture as well, but kind of creating it as this idea of oh, we're all in one, we're in relationships, we're able to be civil together, but still this idea behind their head of we're getting rid of them. They're close enough but not yet. And so this then is essentially trying to, this comes into the concept of mixed races. And mixed races are definitely, or mixed individuals are definitely an interesting thing. And I think especially in the 21st century, being mixed really changed from being a bad thing to being a good thing.
Definitely.
And so it kind of just makes me think of this idea of the fetishization of mixed children that has recently boomed, where you hear people talking about wanting to necessarily blend over in races so that they can have beautiful children. But I've noticed that the children that they are talking about that they want the characteristics are light hair, light eyes, the perfect light skin where it's not too much and not too little, and having this very specific vision of how they want their children to look, and it all is predominantly the white genes on to the child. It's kind of emphasizing that. And this is really true and apparent in our society, especially in America and the Kardashians. I hate that I have to use this as an example, but who is it? Kim, Kylie, and Khloe. They all have...
Wait. Never mind.
They all have mixed children. And it really pains me to say this, but Khloe's daughter, True Thompson, she received backlash on Twitter being called ugly. She's a 1-year-old, by the way, being called ugly because she's darker than the rest of her cousins, and how she was too dark. And I think this is just something really interesting to pull from, because I think it makes sense. And it does make sense. You have these ideas of what is okay when it's mixed, and there's also the ideas of the 1-drop rule, which is if you have 1 drop of anything but white, you're inferior regardless of how much. It's 1 drop, you're inferior. And this still plays even though she has white background. And just her being a child, I think, shows how deeply entrenched these ideas were formed and perpetuated, because nothing can explain why you would call a 1-year-old ugly. unless you had like ideas of racism within you and still prevalent in society. So that was kind of one way that I saw it, and a parallel that I saw between the ideas around racial amalgamation in New Zealand, and how this like fetishization and this specific idea of what a mixed child should look like, and then also seeing it in practice with racism on it heavily.
Yeah.
Which leads me into my next point, or a different event and different colonial power. We're now moving to France. And so I think something that was interesting, we talked about this idea of negrophilia. And this was a word that described I think it means like the love of Negro.
Yeah.
And so it's a word that describes the fascination and sexualization of Black culture. And so it came about at a time where, like I said, whiteness and being the superior race, it's really unstable, because everything is kind of telling you it's not true. Yeah. So you have to keep shifting to be like, oh, but this, make it work all the time. So France was going through a time where whiteness was very unstable. World War I had just taken place, and there was a lot going on in society. And so as a means to escape, a lot of the younger generation, they started looking towards different ideologies, and this led into what was exotic. They were very interested in what was exotic, and it also allowed individuals to make to pierce through the constraints of whiteness and kind of engage in Black culture and engage in Blackness in a way that was not deemed allowed, but they desperately wanted to. Because there's this fascination with Black people. It's this idea of like fascination, but like entrancement also as well. So like negrophilia was really this big movement of white French people getting to engage in Black culture in a way that they had never been able to before. And you also pair this with the idea of the negritude movement, which was a movement that was taking place in France with the Black scholars and Black individuals coming to make sense of what it means to be Black, because they have kind of around this time made their place in, well, not really made their place in society, but there was more of a place in society for them to kind of start to question it and come together. And so it really allowed for a boom of French people to work through Black culture and test the bounds of what was accepted in society. And so we see an obsession with Black culture in art, in fashion, in like exotic masks. Like they're going all over the place they can to engage in African culture. And so then this kind of gets into the conversation of cultural appropriation and the modern iterations of cultural appropriation. Could be, well, cultural appropriation, blackfishing, and just the exploitation of Black culture to the benefit of others. So examples of this could be like slang terms, for example, are typically modern or not, is adopted like African American vernacular, and that credit is never given to the people who created it. It's just like, oh, this is a cool new word to say, instead of bringing the credit to the people who actually created that word and who use it every single day. And it's just another thing that's trending. Or I think especially with social media as well, there's this kind of this idea of not of like blackfishing or taking on some ideas from Black cultures to, again, bolster yourself up or to make yourself seem more cool or use it to benefit yourself. And so we see this in celebrities too. I think Eminem is a great example of that as a white guy who made his way into a very heavily Black culture, which is like rap. And he even sings it in a song. He's like, the last person to do Black music so selfishly and use it to make myself wealthy. And he's like recognizing that as well. Yeah, it's a really interesting line. But cultural appropriation has been something that has like continuously grown, and it's also been something that white individuals have been able to do and feel comfortable in because there's no one to check them.
Mm-hmm.
So you can kind of see how there's this idea that they can move through it freely and not take on any of the negative attributes that come with being black, but be able to take it and again exploit it.
Use it for their own gain.
Ugh. And so then the last one, and I think the biggest one that I think is very prevalent in modern society, is the exploitation and colonization of black women's bodies specifically. And this one you definitely have to look through with the lens of what race and gender mean, because there is the intersection of all of that in every single case, but specifically this one. So black women were used in society for a number of reasons. One of the ways in which they were used was to be a parallel and the antithesis for white women. And so white women, right, under this idea, if they have to be superior, so they're described as virtuous and pure. And so on the opposite of that, black women were vivacious and sexual. And so by labeling as that, it could also justify how their bodies were sexualized by means of rape, and allow white men to be intrigued and attracted by black women because it's in their nature, not because they're genuinely attracted to another race that they deem inferior, but because it's in their nature. And it also like justified how they were allowed to rape them. And as well, white women could sexualize black men, but not in the same way as white women could sexualize, or not in the same way that white men could sexualize black women, because white women had the ability to birth free children, which was really big, right? Because if you could birth free children, like, you had a lot of power in that, and it gave white women quite a lot of power having the ability to do that. And so it wasn't really ever going to happen for a black man and a white woman to have sexual relations on this terms, because black men, again, they're seen as lesser and also as dangerous. So it would most likely assume that she was raped. They would never assume that that relationship was valid. They would assume that there would have to be some violence enacted on her. Because it just doesn't play into their idea of like inferior and superior. Like, you can't, even though they do feel those ways. And so, right, black women are the antithesis to white women, and they cannot birth free children. And so white men then have the ability to manipulate and use black women's bodies in any way they want. And they have continuously. And when I say that, like, there's really no limitation to the violation or intrusions that they can put on black women's bodies. And also, black women not being able to birth free children meant that if a black woman was raped by a white man and she was pregnant, that child would not be free. So then there was no incentive for white men not to act on their lust for black women. So there really was no limitation to the violation or intrusions. And I think one of the best examples, and definitely one of the hardest examples to work through, was from the book Venus Noir, written by Robin Mitchell. And she talks about 3 different black women and how their bodies were used different ways, in different contexts, to make sense of people's racism, how they viewed the women, and again, just overall the exploitation of their bodies to prove their ideas and to make use of it to their benefit. And so one of the women's name was Sarah Bartman, and she was...
I was actually just watching a video on her.
Okay, really? Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
So you kind of, like, a little bit of background context on her is that she was from South Africa, and they don't really know how she was taken. She was captured, and then she was brought to France, and from there she worked in essentially like sideshows, circuses, because that was kind of the best place that she could. But one of the biggest things was she had a very perplexing body shape to French people. She had a very not very large, but she had a larger bottom, um, and her stature was very small. Actually, Professor Mitchell came to class, and she actually got to see a body cast of Sarah Bartman that was made, and she told us that she was just about around like 4 feet.
Wow.
So very small.
Very small.
And it's just, again, like a reminder that she was there.
Mm-hmm.
But Sarah Bartman, she happened to be in relations with a man named, what was his name? Georges Cuvier. And he was kind of like a scientist, but you know, white men didn't really need a whole lot of background to be what they just kind of said what they were and did it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she was with Georges Cuvier, she was like examined, and he essentially dissected her when she had died. And they don't really know why she died, they just know when she died. But throughout her life, she was talking to Georges Cuvier, and he was like her supervisor. Mm-hmm. And when she died, he got permission from the crematory, what did they call it when you die?
The morgue?
The morgue, yes. And from like the government, he got permission to dissect her body. And so that's what he did. He cut her up, he dissected her, he pickled her, he looked inside of her, and that's kind of was the big thing, where it's like the violation was just obscene because there was no need to do that. She had
she's not a science experiment.
Yeah, but her body, again, it's not her own. It was treated as hers, as theirs, and that he could do whatever he wanted with it, and he truly did. Mm-hmm. And it shows the power dynamic, and again, the lack of restraint to violation. And Sarah Bartman, one of the things that perplexed Cuvier was her vagina. Mm-hmm. She had a longer labia, and so they thought there was something different with it, and he was like, they thought that it was her vagina was closer to that of a monkey, and he wanted to like kind of use that and prove it and be like, look, she's not human, she is lesser than. And he even asked her while she was alive if he could look inside of her vagina, and this is the only like recorded like word that Sarah Bartman was said, and she told him no. Mm-hmm. But he still had asked her while she was alive because he didn't see anything wrong with it. But if you think about it, would he ever ask a white woman that, or even begin to think that he could ask a white woman to look at her genitalia in such depth? No. Really no. And then after she had died, he looked.
He still did that.
He did. And he found nothing different.
Yep.
And so a parallel that I wanted to pull from this was how this kind of continued, and how Black women's bodies have still been extremely violated, and the repercussions of that do still last. And so there's another man whose name is James Marion Simmons, and he's known as the father of modern gynecological surgery. And he did this through an extremely unethical practice of practicing on enslaved women, kind of experimenting on them and exploring and conducting his practice on. He also did not use any painkillers. And this kind of also fed into this stereotype of, well, he also used like Black people don't feel pain because they had to justify the amount of violence and the amount of like pain they were putting them through, and working and being like they don't feel pain as much as they do. So he worked on them without any sort of painkillers at all, and again, it was surgical practice. And from this came a lot. Like, he is the father of modern gynecological practice because he learned a lot from doing this, and we gained a lot of knowledge on female anatomy, but only through the means of exploiting and using Black women's bodies without their permission. And so this idea is still around today, like, of that Black people have a higher pain tolerance. Black women, they experience higher rates of death when it comes to childbirth, And this is because of the negligence of many doctors not believing Black women when they tell them that something is wrong or that they are experiencing pain. Most doctors, not most doctors, but there definitely is, there's racism that is intertwined in it, unfortunately, that has caused the death of some Black women just because it's not believed from that sense. That was a lot. But I hope from that conversation you can definitely see where context definitely needs to come into play, and you can use it to really trace back and see where these ideas of race and where these ideas of gender come from, and how, although the context has changed a lot from, the 19th century, there's still these ideas that are still here and deeply entrenched in our society because it's so deeply entrenched in the past and has paved the way. Every single step of the way has been paved with ideas of racism, and it has to have, though.
It's what our society was built upon.
And so it's just extremely important to understand the historical context in order to be made sense of the way in that the world works, because without it, you just kind of allow for it to continue going on without questioning what's really going on here. And that just fills into the arrogance that white people are superior and everyone else is inferior, because that's really not the truth.
Not at all.
Yeah, but anything to say, or?
When you were talking about the pain tolerance of Black people, the only thing I want to say is that I think we do have a higher pain tolerance, but psychologically. Just because of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there definitely is, and I know even, studies and things like that to figure out, how, trauma is carried through the genomes and things like that in different ways. This is, completely off sidetrack, but, one of the reasons, you can see is, have you ever, there's this joke that when Black people laugh, they run. Or, when Black people start laughing, they run. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Something's funny, you start running around. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's a stereotype of Black people, where it's if you start laughing, you can't stay still. And I know I've seen that in it. But it actually does have ties to colonialism. Because if you were on, say, a plantation, and you were heard to be laughing or something, fun wasn't allowed, really. There was none of that. You would be hurt or you'd be killed or something, so you would have to run. And that's still kind of with us, and there's little small bits of that, but even something as small as that, I would never have made the connection to racism or colonization in that way had I not taken the time in this class to understand the historical context of things, or even just been exposed to it. And so I definitely feel like there is more progression in society to try to not disregard colonialism and what it has done.
I'm very grateful just to hear about how many different people and media outlets have been talking about it in this way. I don't know, it's pretty powerful. But there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, there definitely is, and there's more ways to view colonialism as well, and so many different conversations that happen with it. But thank you again so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me, and hopefully I hope that you have a deeper understanding of how the world works just a little bit, and are willing to look deeper whenever you see something and not just accept it as truth, but think there's probably a reason for this, and be completely surprised by the reason.
Thank you very much for telling me all these things. It was really special, and I'm glad that I was able to help with your project.
Yes, thank you.